guys, I'm Katie SALIDAS. I am a paranormal and urban fantasy author. My young adult series is the Little Werewolf series set in Las Vegas, and I'm also the host and producer of the Spilling Ink Show.
Hi, I'm Suzy VADORI, and I'm up in Calgary, Canada, and I am a young adult fantasy romance author. And my series is the Fountain series, and it has 2 books in it, The Fountain and The Westwoods.
Hi, I'm Jenna Greene from Lethbridge, Canada. So I'm Suzy's neighbor just 2 hours to the south. I'm a YA fantasy author. I have a high fantasy series. The first novel is a magic. And I have a dystopian series with the first novel being called Reborn. Podcasting, talking to authors and all around the globe and learning more from them with the Quill and Ink podcast with Miranda O.
Hi, I'm Julia. I write as J.K. Allen, and I write primarily young adult urban fantasy. My series is the Angelborn series, and I'm also the president and head editor for Three Furious Press.
Hi, I'm DAHLGREN. I've been designing and writing for computer games most of my life. And while I've developed all kinds of games, my favorite genre is the narrative-heavy adventure. And I'm making those. I authored original fantasy and science fiction storylines that took established world-class literary properties into interactive experience. And those games gave me the opportunity to work with best-selling authors like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, known for Dragonlance and the Deathgate cycle. Robert Jordan, who wrote The Wheel of Time, it's soon to be a TV series, and Terry Brooks of Shannara fame. I've also written for the Star Trek franchise, as well as Stan Sakai's epic graphic novel series, Usagi Yojimbo. I teach a course on game design every summer to international students at UC Berkeley. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area with my lovely wife and 2 teenage children, who are all incredibly excited because in a few months, Rhetoric Askew will be publishing my debut young fantasy adult novel, The Child of Chaos.
Young adult fiction is a category of fiction written for readers from 12 to 18 years of age. While the genre is targeted at teenagers, approximately half of YA readers are adults. Common themes related to YA include friendship, first love, relationships, and identity.
They're right, but it's just a little bit more complicated than maybe what they make it seem. Mm-hmm. Statistically speaking, the most YA readers are, at least for the books I write, because my protagonists are women between the ages of 35 and 50. From the teaching point of view, we're taught that when we're trying to pick literature to teach as novel studies in our class, that we want to match the age of the character with the age of our students. So, for example, I teach sometimes the book, The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle. She's 13, so I teach it to grades 7, 8 students that are 12 and 13. So it's kind of weird because the audience is aimed at younger, but also aimed at older.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, guys. I think that's something that I often have to explain to readers is that we do have a lot of adult readers. And so I write YA, and the series that I was talking about, the Fountain series, is a little bit on the earlier end of that spectrum. Like I get a lot of 12 and 13-year-old readers. And what's funny to me is that everybody who reviews my books is actually an adult. So, because kids don't generally review books. So we end up having people that are, in their 40s reviewing my books. So they have to be written with that dual readership in mind, because otherwise I get people reading, you don't want somebody to read the book and go, oh, it seemed really juvenile. It's like, well, you're reading a young adult book, but it has to also hit that adult market, which is a tricky balance, right?
That's a really big point, the whole which market it's for, because a lot of times when I think of young adult, my initial response is coming of age, because the teenage years are usually a period of great transition for most people. And so when I look at young adult, I think of that more high school aged character you know, dealing with all the changes that are happening to them, dealing with all the social changes, becoming that adult. And I usually look at like what Jen had said about the age of the protagonist is the target for who you're trying to read, or who you're trying to aim your readership at. Although we do have so many adults that are reading young adult, and I've always wondered why they're drawn so much to that versus just adult novels. And I think it has to do with the nostalgia effect of we remember how much change and how much turmoil we went through during those years, and that kind of draws us into that drama.
I would disagree with some of what you guys are saying. I went to a conference a few years ago, and they talked specifically about young adult and the reading patterns of children. So children up to the age of 8 want to read about children their own age because that's the only thing they relate to. But after the age of 8, they actually want to start reading up. So they want to read about older kids and what's going to happen to them next. So usually when you say if you have like a 16-year-old character, it's actually going to be 12 to 13-year-olds that are going to, and you know, a little up, that are going to be reading that character rather than other 16-year-olds necessarily, which I can relate to because I know when I was young, I was definitely reading older books than like my age group. But I would say, you know, with what Katie was saying, I think it's the themes of young adult that is what really like captures an adult audience, is that coming to terms with your identity, finding out who you are and who you want to be, falling in love for the first time and figuring out, you know, what you want from a relationship and friendships and everything Joe was saying in his wonderful explanation about what the themes of YA are. I think as adults, we kind of find ourselves trying to figure that stuff out again.
I take a little difference with the idea that young adult is a genre, because young adult actually isn't a genre. It's just it is about the market. Young adult encompasses every genre. I'm working in fantasy, but there are lots and lots and lots. I read a list that is about, I don't know, 20 different genres incorporated in young adult. And as far as why adults are reading young adult, and it's true. I think up to 70% of young adult purchases are by adults, and I think 78% of those people are reading it themselves. I think it's not just about the subject material, although clearly it's about the subject material, but it's also about approachability. Young adult novels are written such that they are more action-oriented. They're clearer. They're not about intricate prose. They're not about wowing the reader with the author's ability to write. It's more about action. It's more about character, and adults like that.
Can I argue that YA is a genre and also not a genre in that it's an age group, it's a reading group, but there are things you can do in YA that you can't do perhaps in adult literature. No one thinks twice to have a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old have a prophecy that they're going to save the world, but we don't get a lot of those books where it's like a 59-year-old retiree or divorcee or an 88-year-old woman and her best friend with a cane going to save the world. There's just some boundaries that are a bit looser in YA, but we can still cover those really, really deep, intricate themes and topics. We can cover racism to slavery to society to politics to anything, and it's all accepted.
Now I kind of want to write a book about an 88-year-old lady that saves the world. I'm kind of thinking about it.
She has to have a cane and she has to have her bestie.
Yeah.
There are rules, and we'll get into that as well a little bit, which is interesting. You know, to make it YA, to keep it within the YA area. And I'm kind of curious from each of you to know what rules you specifically keep in mind and maintain when you're writing young adult, and the mindset that you have when you're attacking from this perspective. Is there certain things that you absolutely, you know, the tropes that you stay away from? Are there ones you embrace? How do you approach that aspect of how you write in this genre?
I was going to say, Joe, that the biggest thing or the biggest rule in YA that sets it apart and almost makes it a genre is pace. I think, and you guys can comment on this too, but just that they tend to be really fast paced. And I think that that might also be why adults read them, because the pace is different than anything else. So whether you're writing a historical fiction or fantasy or anything else, you likely have a lot more action than you would in an adult story. And the pace just goes. And sometimes I have adults that read my books that don't normally read young adult, and they'll say to me, wow, it was like getting hit in the face over and over and over again. Like, why isn't there a lull? Like, I needed that lull. But then you're not a YA reader probably if you need that.
One of the tropes that I struggle with is the romance part. Because I read a lot of YA. I genuinely like it. And there's dozens, hundreds of books where the protagonist finds the love of her life or his life, and they stay together forever. And it bugs me to no end that the first romance you ever find at 15 or 16 is going to be the love of your life. So, but yet there's that real desire in readers to have that romantic plot line or subplot line. So in my books, I try to offer it, but in a different way, where maybe this isn't the love of your life, but just a nice person, or, love interests around, but that's not really the point. And sometimes my readers are disappointed, and sometimes they're really happy by that. But it's a struggle, and it's a balancing act, and it drives me cuckoo bananas.
So basically, it's more realistic, and basically my high school love life.
I try.
Remember back to your first love. It was like the most powerful thing that you've ever experienced. And again, going back to the nostalgia effect that I think adult readers get with going back to YA is they remember how intense and how powerful it was to find that person, the very first person that you love, and all of those first experiences you have with them, the awkward first kisses, the dates, the holding hands. Everything is new. Everything seems more magical when you're that young. And if you can capture that, I think not only do the readers of that age range enjoy it, but I think the adult readers also can kind of relive those feelings for themselves too.
The interesting thing about this genre I found that is different is that it's a contemporary genre. A lot of where it really started to get its legs, and really, I mean, there are classics like Catcher in the Rye, Lord of the Flies, The Outsiders, and etc. But where it really starts to catch its legs is in the time period in which we all grew up. I'm wondering now, that having discussed this a little bit, is that why adults are gravitating toward this genre? Is because we didn't have that gap, that bridged the gap for us during that time frame, and now that fiction is there, and we're kind of reliving those moments.
I think maybe it's the identification of the market segment and the success of identifying literature as young adult. And now clearly people have followed that and created rules for what young adult means and have written towards that. But I mean, I grew up on like classic fantasy, and that's kind of what inspires me and informs a lot of my writing. And in fact, I find myself kind of in young adult by accident. I wrote a protagonist that is in that age range. He goes through a coming of age, but it wasn't written specifically for that market segment. And my page count kind of reflects that. But I'd say that it's more about people saw success and people went for it.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that they found an audience, that was eager to snatch up books and create fandoms, and it's great because it got people reading again, and I really love that. But like, they tried to do that again with the whole new adult genre because young adult was so hot that they wanted to like keep it going.
I actually have a question about that. I mean, so new adult, as I understand it, it kind of translates to more romance and sexual experiences. Is that, did people think that's
new adult? Well, the way I always understood new adult is it's like, it's the next age group. So it's like 19 to, 23. And it's about, getting your first apartment, starting your first serious relationship, going off to college, having sex for the first time, or, you know, figuring out kind of the next level steps of adulting, as opposed to where like young adult is the high school experience where you're figuring out who you are and like some of the things we talked about already. There's kind of like two different camps in young adult as far as like how clean versus how steamy things can get, because like, let's face it, in today's world, you know, things do get steamy for teenagers nowadays, you know, and dating is different, and everything, expectations of dating are different. I personally write very clean, but that's just my writing style. It has nothing to do with, you know, judgment of, you know, whether we should uphold some kind of moral virtue or something, you know, in young adult. I think, you know, I appreciate people who write on both sides of the line. But I know that's a big thing I see in YA writing groups on Facebook all the time is, how far can I push the limit, or how clean does it have to be? And this isn't just applying to like sex, but also like drugs and other like issues like abuse. And that's kind of, I think, where the idea of new adult came from, because new adult could push it more and feel safer because it was a little bit older characters.
What's interesting about YA is that you have the tendency is to be a little bit cleaner with romance and drugs, but violence, apparently, it's all free game.
You just spear them through the stomach. It's fine.
Yeah.
You can have as much gory, graphic violence as you want, and people don't tend to bat an eye. But the minute somebody either curses, or you have maybe a sex scene that doesn't fade to black, and oh my God, hold on a second, we can't show this.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I would kind of treat it like a PG-13 movie. You get like one big swear word, you know, like.
A big part of my career as an author in YA is in schools. And so I do a lot of touring in schools or Girl Guides or that type of thing. And so, yeah, for me, I write clean as well, but I do it because I'm a mom and I want my kids to read it. But I also have found that opens a lot of doors. I think there's room for books with all kinds of spectrum in terms of cursing or other experiences. But for me, it's opened a lot of doors to have it be clean, because then they can discuss it.
If you do approach sex in a young adult book, you can have your characters being responsible about having sex, you know, being protected, you know, talking about it beforehand, having actual conversations. And that could also be a way to bridge that gap between, you know, being too prudish and showing too much. Doing it in a respectful way can also give a good example.
So I write in fantasy, and I actually don't have a lot of sex in my books. I have a little bit of romance, but I do have violence. And I think fantasy can tend to lend in that direction. But one thing I did learn in my time as a game developer is that, I mean, you said 12-year-olds are reading up, you know, they're reading about 16-year-olds. It's true. You cannot underestimate what kids want to read, or the intelligence of your readers. And so my books tend to get pretty dark, but every person, every child that has read it has really connected with that material. So I'm, and all the research that I've said pretty much is that nothing is off limits. I'm not trying to corrupt anybody, but I do think that they're not shying away from fairly dark material.
You are writing for an audience of younger readers. So how important is it to you? How much weight do you feel in providing social commentary, and how much do you think about when you're writing this is the impact you might have when you're writing, when you're going to produce something like this?
My books are very dark, and there's violence, and there's slavery, and there's abuse, but it's really how you address those topics, that you have violence, but you show the character struggling with it, and not just, oh, he died, oh well. It's the emotions that they go through. It's the actions that they take or try to take. I mean, think of the book Speak, one of the most powerful, poignant from the 90s, I think, YA books, and that's about rape. And the whole thing is just handled beautifully. And I mean, I think even adults can go read that book and become a better person and have a better understanding. And so you can deal with dark topics as long as you handle it appropriately and respectfully and don't just brush it off.
I would also add, and of course you never want to talk down to your audience, but and as far as social commentary and all of that, the other thing you don't want to do is obviously give them a lesson. If you're trying to tell people how to behave, they will tend to see right through that, and they get turned off. If you weave a theme into the book, and overall that's where your story is going, that's great. But I don't view the story as the place as a vehicle for changing someone's behavior necessarily, or at least not obviously.
Great way to show tasteful examples of things. For instance, the LGBTQ community really appreciates seeing stories in that age group about those kind of relationships. I had a couple come up to me at a Comic-Con recently, and it was a teenage couple, and they were specifically looking for books that were speaking to them, that had those characters in there so that they could relate to them better. And so you can use that as a way to show those kind of relationships in a natural way through the story.
Yeah, exposure to that kind of thing is critical, but preaching is the problem.
Yes, absolutely. Don't preach. I agree.
One of the things I love about YA is the fact that you're getting into the mindset of a time period in which you've lived your life before, but you're not necessarily there anymore. The mind hopefully has matured and grown as time has gone on. But when you're approaching the characters that you are writing about, how do you go back in time and recapture that momentum?
I actually remember everything about my childhood. So for me, I guess maybe I lived there all the time. But I also have teenagers in my house, and so it's fun to talk about those stories and to bring those back. We talked earlier about themes, and Jenna said that she hates romance, that is like you find your forever person at 15 or whatever. And so that's one of the themes in my book is making sure, or my books is making sure that you are making choices that are for you, and that it's okay to, choose somebody else, and to figure that out at that age. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun talking. Like I said, I'm in schools a lot, and with my own kids, I'm around kids all the time, and hearing that it sort of resonates with them is really exciting. So
as a mom of a teenager, I try, when I'm writing young adult books, I try and look at what is she gonna appreciate? Because again, they do read up. What is she going to enjoy reading about? And a lot of times when I talk to her, she likes to see, current event type struggles, things that she would deal with. It's again back to the relationship things, the brand new relationships, drama between friends, what's happening there, and finding the strength to speak up for yourself. So I look at those kind of themes when I'm writing and trying to incorporate them without sugarcoating too much, because I know when I was in that age group, I was reading Anne Rice, and I shouldn't have been reading at 14, those kind of books, but I was, because that's what interested me. And had my mom known I was reading them, she'd have probably taken them away from me. So I don't ever want to talk down to my readers by sugarcoating things too much, but I also want to find what they're actually going to be interested in. And so I use my teenager as my guide.
Well, it helps that I'm a teacher. So again, I'm around a lot of students as well. Just switched from grade 6 to grade 1, but there's a lot of similarities there. But I don't know, maybe it helps that I'm not super mature, or I don't feel like an adult most of the time. And so, I mean, a lot of my characters are doing things that I couldn't do. They fail a lot, which I could do, but then they succeed later. I mean, reading a lot of YA helps definitely. Just being around kids in general of any age helps. And then just writing a good story.
For me, it's more about like, what is the personality of my character? Because, when you look at teenagers, yeah, there's the silly, goofy ones, and yeah, but there's also the mature ones who speak differently and maybe don't use the same slang. And, just like you find adults who still say yeet and, Yahoo, even though they're in their, late 20s. So, I think about like who is my character really when we get down to that level, and that determines like the way they talk and what they do. And of course, you do have to, throw in a little bit of like lack of judgment and emotional immaturity. But, you can't typecast all teenagers as like a bubbly, laughing bunch of fools.
Lastly, I want to talk about the future of YA and the idea of that kids are reading more, they're expanding their minds more, or doing that. And it seems like the maturity factor is earlier and earlier in development these days. And so what you're looking at when you're thinking about either your next series, your next book.
Well, for me, I'm going to definitely keep like hope and stuff in my series, and like still have positive themes. Like I said, I like, finding who you are, finding your identity, things like that. I love to explore. But I do want to make it more and more realistic. Like the character I'm writing, has anxiety. And that's something that like a lot of young people are starting to deal with more and more, are, mental health conditions. And, we didn't really talk about until more recently. So like just giving a voice to characters who are not quote unquote normal and have issues, and how they deal with it is what I'm trying to do.
More and more as I write, the themes of strong women are coming into play. And I know at first I was doing it because that's what the genre was looking for, was to make sure that your female protagonists are making their own decisions. But more and more as I speak to groups and go out there, I mean, I came up through a time, I was a business executive in my former career before I started doing this full time. I worked on Wall Street. So being in a male-dominated career, I really have found a voice in being able to say what I did in my career and how I was able to stand up to that. So that's been really cool to have those female protagonists. And I think I've got 2 daughters and a son, but I think it's equally as important to teach our boys about women. And that women can be strong, and teaching them to respect women as it is for girls to see those strong protagonists and some ideals about what it can be.
When I write, I don't write specifically for something to be young adult, new adult, whatever. When I write the story that comes to me that I want to write. But ultimately, a lot of my stories have a similar theme of don't take everything at face value. And I think lately with a lot of inclusion and a lot of being able to show different types of relationships and different types of characters, I think we're able to do that more now with less fallback, less bad reviews from people for showing those relationships that might be different. So I try and employ that as much as I possibly can, respectfully. I don't want to, show the LGBT community a bad representation of, perhaps a gay couple, or I do want to be respectful when I approach it, but we are able to do that now more often than we were in the past. And so I like to include that with my typical theme.
One of YA's defining characteristics is about the perspective of the protagonist. It's about what's going on in their head. The idea that they are dealing with all of these dark themes is really important. And how they emotionally react and to that is actually probably more important than the scene itself. So the advice that I've been given is it's more important to talk about that reaction than it is to describe the thing that they're reacting to. I want people to feel like the themes are important, but I don't think I'm going to change the way that I write stories or to capitalize on any fads or anything like that. It simply has to be a great story that speaks to me and then hopefully then to other people.
Can I just repeat everything Glenn says?
Sure.
And that's my answer.
My teenage years sucked. I hated being a teenager. It was the worst time of my life.
Preach, sister.
I'm not nostalgic at all for those years. In fact, I actually tried to avoid writing the young adult book for a long time, but I kept being pushed towards it, so I did. And it was actually fun to write, and it was a great story. But I use my teenager as my touchstone for things to relate to her age group right now. but I think more of an idealized version is what I write than what I actually went through.